The dish was still warm when they set it down on my table, and none of them said a single word. 3 women. 3 casseroles. One long look at the empty chair where my husband used to sit. That was the beginning, though I did not understand it yet. Whatever you are picturing right now, a soft casserole and kind neighbors bringing grief food, that is not the kind of story this is. Stay with me, because for the next 20 years, that quiet visit repeated itself in ways I could not have imagined, and I counted every one. 17 visits before I understood what they were really for. My name is Rebecca, and I grew up in a strict old-order Amish settlement in central Pennsylvania. I left when I was 51, 20 years after I buried my husband, and now I tell the stories we were taught to swallow with our supper. If you grew up in a world where silence was called obedience, and grief was treated like a problem to solve, tell me in the comments. Subscribe if you want to hear the parts we were never allowed to say out loud, and know that I read every message you leave me. You are not talking to no one. To understand what happened at that kitchen table, you have to understand the world it happened in. In our settlement, everything ran by the ordnung, the unwritten and written rules our bishop kept like a second Bible. The ordnung told us what color our dresses could be, how wide our hat brims should sit, whether our buggies had gray tops or black, and whether a woman could cut her hair, which she could not. But the ordnung most people talk about is only the outside of the cage. The real ordnung was the one no one wrote down. It lived in the eyes of the older women when you laughed too loud. It lived in the way a bishop cleared his throat before your father spoke. It lived in the space between what a woman wanted and what a woman was allowed. A woman in our world was a daughter, then a wife, then a mother, then a grandmother. There was no other shape for us. We were baptized around 18 or 19, married soon after, and expected to bear as many children as God gave us. Our aprons were pinned before dawn and unpinned after dark. We cooked, canned, quilted, cleaned, gardened, birthed, and buried, and if we did all of it without complaint, we were called a good woman. If we did any of it with a question in our mouth, we were called proud. Pride was the worst thing a woman could be. Pride got you talked about at the sewing table. Pride got you visited by the bishop's wife. Pride got you shunned. I married Jonas when I was 19. He was gentle in his own quiet way, not warm, not cruel, just steady like a good horse. We had 4 children in 7 years. He died in an accident with a hay wagon when I was 31, and our youngest was still nursing. I remember the moment they carried him into the house on a door, because I remember thinking the kitchen suddenly felt colder, like someone had opened a window I could not see. That cold never fully left. The funeral came and went the way our funerals do. Plain pine box. Long benches. Songs sung slow. Women in the kitchen slicing ham. Men in the barn nodding without speaking. And then, within a month, the dishes started arriving. The first visit, I thought, was kindness. 3 women from the church, one of them the deacon's wife, sat at my table and told me that the Lord had a plan for widows too. They mentioned a man in the next district, older, whose wife had passed the winter before. He had 6 children. He needed a mother for them. I said I was not ready. They smiled the smile our women learn young, the one that means we heard you, and we will pretend you did not say it. They set the casserole down and left. The second visit was 2 months later. A different man this time. A widower closer to my age. They reminded me my youngest needed a father. They reminded me my farm needed a man. They reminded me that a woman alone was a burden on the church. I said I was still grieving. That smile again. That dish again. By the 5th visit, I understood the pattern. By the 10th, I understood the punishment. Because when a woman in our settlement refused to remarry, the elders were allowed to do things that no one outside would ever call discipline. They were allowed to stop sending the young men to help with my roof when it leaked. They were allowed to seat me at the back of the church bench, behind the newer wives, where the draft came in under the door. They were allowed to remove my name from the quilting circle rotation, quietly, so that when I showed up, there was no chair. They were allowed to speak to my sons about my stubbornness, so my own boys came home asking why I would not do what was right. They were allowed to visit my brother and suggest that he take over decisions for my farm, since a woman without a husband could not be trusted to know her own mind. They were allowed to withhold. That was the word I learned much later, in a therapist's office in Ohio. Withholding. In our world, we did not have a word for it. We only had the cold. The bishop came himself in the 5th year. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where the dishes kept arriving, and he told me that a widow who refused a good match was refusing the will of God. He said my children were suffering. He said the community was watching. He said if I did not soften my heart, he could not promise me a place at the communion table come fall. Not shunning, not officially. Just a slow removal. A slow forgetting. A slow way of turning a woman into a shadow in her own church. I remember looking at his hands folded on my tablecloth, and I remember thinking something I had never let myself think before. I thought, he does not actually care whether I remarry. He cares whether I obey. That was the first crack in the wall. The older women in our settlement had a way of warning each other without ever saying anything directly. They would say things like, "The Lord gives us more than we can bear sometimes, and we bear it anyway." They would say, "A quiet woman sleeps well." They would say, "Don't let the winter get into your bones, Rebecca." That last one was said to me by an old woman named Fanny, at a viewing for someone else's husband, and she squeezed my wrist when she said it. She had refused a second marriage 40 years before. Her house had no proper wood stove by then. Her sons had moved to other districts. Her name was almost never spoken. She was warning me, and she was warning herself, and she was telling me she survived. Barely. That is the language we had. Wrist squeezes and weather. Year after year, I refused. I refused the widower with 6 children. I refused the deacon's cousin. I refused the man from Indiana who wrote letters my brother read out loud at the supper table like they were mine to answer. I refused a preacher whose first wife had died in childbirth and whose second wife had died the same way, and when I said no to him, the bishop did not speak to me for a full year. I refused, and I refused, and I refused, and each refusal was smaller than the last, because there was less of me left to refuse with. A woman can become very small, and 20 years of being told her no is a sin. But I kept the farm. I raised my 4 children. I learned to fix a fence and cut hay and read the weather the way my husband used to. I did the work of 2 people so that no man would have a reason to walk through my door and stay. And every fall, when the dishes came again, I set them on the counter and said thank you and closed the door quietly, because a slammed door in our world was a scandal, but a quiet door was allowed. The realization came the year my youngest daughter turned 19. She came to me one evening while I was kneading bread, and she asked me, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, whether she had to marry the boy her father's brother had chosen. And I looked down at my hands, covered in flour, and I saw my mother's hands, and my grandmother's hands, and Fanny's hands, and every hand that had ever kneaded bread in that kitchen while swallowing a whole life. And I understood, finally, that the elders were never really trying to protect widows. They were trying to protect the shape. The shape of a woman with a man over her. The shape of a household with a head. The shape of a community where no woman ever stood alone long enough to realize she could. My refusal was dangerous not because it hurt me. It was dangerous because my daughter was watching. I told her no. I told her she did not have to marry anyone. I told her that her no was allowed to be a full sentence, even if no one in our world had ever said so out loud. And 2 years later, when she left the community, I left with her. I was 51 years old. I had never driven a car. I had never worn a pair of pants. I had never used a telephone for more than a barn line. I sat in a small apartment in a town I did not know, and I cried for a week, because grief for a life you chose to leave is a different kind of grief, and no one warns you about it. The therapist I saw in that first year was a soft-spoken woman who never once told me what I should feel. She was the one who gave me the word withholding. She gave me coercion. She gave me spiritual abuse, and she said those words gently, the way you hand someone a hot cup. She told me that what the elders had been allowed to do to me was not discipline. It was punishment for existing outside the shape. She told me that 20 years of small colds in a kitchen add up to a winter that lives inside the body. And she told me my body had been trying to tell me the truth long before my mouth was allowed to say it. If you are listening to this, and you live in a house where your grief is treated as a problem to be married off, where your no is called pride, where your silence is called peace, I want you to hear me. You are not imagining it. The cage is real, even if no one ever wrote it down. The rules that hurt the most are the ones that were never spoken, because you cannot point at them, and you cannot show them to anyone, and for a long time you cannot even be sure they exist. But your body knows. Your body has always known. I am 63 now. My daughters visit me in a house with electricity and a phone that rings sometimes for no reason at all, and I answer it every time, because I like the sound. I still bake bread. I still wear a scarf when I go out in the cold. Some habits are not the cage. Some habits are just who you are. But last week, a neighbor lost her husband, and she came to my door with her eyes still swollen, and she asked me what she should do. And I did not bring her a casserole. I sat down at her table, and I told her she did not have to decide anything for a year. I told her the dish on her counter was not a contract. I told her that when they come, and they will come, she can say no, and her no is a whole sentence. It always was.